ناشئة الليل هي أشد وطئا وأقوم قيلا إن لك في النهار سبحا طويلا واذكر اسم ربك وتبتل إليه تبتيلا رب المشرق والمغرب لا إله إلا هو فاتخذه وكيلا واصبر على ما يقولون واهجرهم هجرا جميلا وذرني والمكذبين أولي النعمة ومهلهم قليلا إن لدينا أنكالا وجحيما وطعاما ذا غصة وعذابا أليما يوم ترجف الأرض والجبال وكانت الجبال كثيبا مهيلا إنا أرسلنا إليكم رسولا شاهدا عليكم كما أرسلنا إليكم رسولا شاهدا عليكم كما أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا فعصى فرعون الرسول فأخذناه أخذا وبيلا فكيف تتقون إن كفرتم يوما يجعل الولدان شيبا السماء منفطر به كان وعده مفعولا إن هذه تذكرة فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا إن ربك يعلم أنك تقوم أدنى من ثلثي الليل ونصفه وثلثه وطائفة من الذين معك والله يقدر الليل والنهار علم أن لن تحصوه فتاب عليكم فاقرؤوا ما تيسر من القرآن علم أن سيكون منكم مرضى وآخرون يضربون في الأرض يبتغون من فضل الله وآخرون يقاتلون في سبيل الله فاقرؤوا ما تيسر منه وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأقرضوا الله قرضا حسنا وما تقدموا لأنفسكم من خير تجدوه عند الله هو خيرا وأعظم أجرا واستغفروا الله إن الله غفور رحيم صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات
Ahsan, Brother Mustafa. For this next portion, we'll get started with the PowerPoint with Sheikh Salim, but just to introduce him, as maybe some of the audience may not know him too well. Sheikh Salim was raised here in Canada, but initially born over in Northwestern Territories, before moving to Alberta for some studying, and then finally over to Qom for more Islamic studying on that part, and then coming back to Canada, working for BlackBerry as well, and then also doing a bunch of work in different communities across Canada with regards to Ahl al-Bayt. He also has a small publication company that he's been running online as well, and then today for the PowerPoint that you will be seeing, he's also accompanying this with one of his books, which is kind of like a fill-in-the-blank to do with your will, and it's a step-by-step instruction guide on what to do when going about this legal document. He does have a couple of copies available for purchase as well. I think on Amazon we said the purchase price was about $18, but today about $10 as well. So those will be available to buy after the program as well. I think we have like 10 to 15 copies on hand. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Sheikh Salim Bhimji up into the podium. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We begin in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. We ask Allah to send His blessings upon all of His emissaries and all of His messengers, and on this blessed day, as we gather for this important obligation that we all have to fulfill, we ask Allah to send our greetings and salutations upon the last and the greatest of His messengers, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We also ask Allah to send our greetings upon the Ahlul Bayt, the preservers of the legacy of Rasulullah, the protectors of the message of the Quran and the guides to Allah. And most importantly, we ask Allah to convey our greetings to our 12th and awaited Savior, Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. May Allah allow all of us to be amongst His helpers and assistants, and to be those who are in His company in paradise as well. As mentioned, that today we have gathered to try our best to understand the Islamic will, how to go about planning for our eventual death. Obviously, we know that, as we have a saying in English, that there are two realities of this world, death and taxes. And a will really hopefully take care of both of those, because if you don't have a will generated accurately, both from the legal perspective and also the Islamic perspective, and we have our respected Brother Mudassir with us to look at the legal perspective, that will have obviously tax implications even after we die. Right? Unfortunately, we live in a society where death does not mean the end of taxes. The government will still come after our money when we're dead. And our goal in this seminar, hopefully, and moving forward, is to ensure that we pay as little as we have to the government. There are many reasons, I don't want to go into that, but obviously our inheritors should get the most of our money. We've worked hard for it, and we want to make sure that our spouse, our children, and even our religious communities benefit from our wealth when we leave this world. So we're going to try and go over the will in this seminar and hopefully cover as much as we can, and then we will obviously have a Q&A session after the presentation for any general questions. We won't be in a position to answer specifics about your own dynamics. Let's say you want to know how much percentage each member of your family will get. I won't be able to go into that, but I will give you links on screen where you will be able to go to a different website, and it will calculate all of the formulas for you and give you the answers based on obviously the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhum as-salam. So with that, let me begin with a verse of the Quran. This is in chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 180, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدُكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. Allah says that prescribed for you when death approaches any of you and he or she leaves behind any property is that he or she make a will for his parents and relatives in an honorable manner, an obligation on the God-conscious ones. So the Quran speaks about death and the will as an obligation. Now, there are different ways that scholars understand this. I'm not going to go into a commentary of the Quran, but basically, generally speaking, a will is not an obligation per se, because in religion, in Islam, every individual who is entitled to inherit from us already has a predetermined allotment. There is already a share given to any member of the family that would inherit. When Allah speaks about this, in this verse, for example, that if you leave behind any property, and He says, Kutiba alaykum, that this is an obligation upon you, and you'll remember that phrase, Kutiba alaykum, even Kutiba alaykum as-siyam in the month of Ramadan. This verse points to the fact that we have an aspect, which I will touch upon later, on a 1/3 of our will, where we can specify who gets to have 1/3 of our will. right? So when we look at this verse, we're looking at it from the holistic perspective where we're not only looking at the estate because that will go to the legal inheritors, but other people will be able to have a share as long as we make a will, right? So one of the things that I would stress upon all of us is that making sure that we have a will, right? Because that 1/3, as I will elaborate upon later on in this discussion, we have an opportunity to direct where those funds go. And if we don't have that will, then we have no mechanism to ensure that certain, wealth we have or certain possessions we have, that it go to a certain individual. So a will becomes imperative because it becomes that vehicle through which all of the possessions that we once owned can then be distributed to many people within the community, the family, the society, and as we will even see, even our religious organizations. We have a hadith, as we can see, from Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, where he says that the one who makes a will, and in this will does not oppress anyone by taking away their rights of inheritance, and does not cause harm to anyone, it is as if they have given away all of their wealth in charity during their lifetime. So that's very important if you think about it, right? We will never have an opportunity to give all of our wealth away, right? First of all, it's not Islamic to do it. Right? We are told we have to have moderation in everything, right? Even when we look at the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, we have the example of Imam Hassan, peace be upon him, where we're told that at least 2 or 3 times he took his entire estate in his lifetime, divided it in half, and gave half away to the needy. But he still kept half for his own family. But here Amir al-Mu'mineen says, if you write a will and you ensure that nobody has been wronged, everybody gets their fair share, he says it is as if you have given away everything in charity in your lifetime. Right? So it's an act of also worship of Allah. It's an act of ibadah. Right? To write the will is not just to jot down a few things where my money should go, where my investments should go. This becomes an act of worship of Allah, of glorifying Allah. And just like we give importance to our salat and fasting and hajj and all of these actions, the will becomes also a part of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we all need to ensure we have in place. And people might say, well, at what age should I write a will? Right? And I tell people that the day that you become baligh, the day that you become of age, girls, let's say 8 or 9 years old, boys 12, 13, 14, you have a bank account, most of you, you'd have some possessions, you should write a will from that very first day. You may only have a few $100s, maybe a PlayStation, maybe a laptop, maybe an iPhone, but those few possessions, and hopefully you won't have missed praying or fasting. Hajj might not be wajib on you, but begin that process of writing a will and updating it regularly as life changes. Because believe me, if you wait till you're 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 and then you're trying to write a will, it's going to become very difficult because you'll accumulate assets, you'll accumulate things in life along the way, you'll have a spouse, you'll have children, and then to kind of catch up becomes very difficult. So start at an early age, and then as your life progresses, changes come up, begin to update that will on a regular basis. So let's begin and answer the question, what is a will? What is this wasiyah, this testament that we are going to be looking at today? So we can divide a will or define it in 5 points. Number 1, it's instructions for a person that they want certain acts to be carried out on their behalf after their death. And again, I'll go into this in more detail. I'm just going to give you the outline now. A second aspect or a definition of the will is that some of your wealth becomes the property of another person after your death. And we'll see how that plays out in terms of obligations and also discretionary wealth that can be given to anybody. Another definition or aspect of a will is that ownership of your property is transferred to somebody else. The fourth one is that some of your wealth be used in acts of charity and welfare for the betterment of humanity. Or number 5 is that the person appoints someone as a guardian and a custodian for their children and or dependents. Right? So there are various aspects of what a will can be. But ultimately, I would say, and even as we mentioned that this book which we have available, it will actually cover all of these areas in one book, right? And obviously we will, stress upon it from now, and that you know that this book presents a lot of the areas, but I would still advise people to go to your legal experts, go to your lawyer and others that you have confidence in, especially from the legal area, to make sure that whatever you do draft is in line with the laws of the land, and that you are not going to cause challenges or people contesting your will after you pass away. So make sure that things are done Islamically, obviously, because as believers that is our obligation, and also make sure they're done legally according to the laws of the country so that there are no issues and further disputes once you leave this world. So moving on, according to Islamic laws, you can see that when a person dies and they leave their inheritance, they have the right to assign 1/3 of their estate as per their own wishes. And the remaining 2/3 are distributed automatically according to preset laws of inheritance. So the ayat of the Quran are there in Surah Al-Baqarah and other ayat, very lengthy, very, I would say, confusing verses, in the sense that the way that the verse Allah has constructed it, it takes a lot of time to read the verse and understand how the breakdown is happening. But Allah has given us this beauty where He says that out of your entire estate, all of the wealth that you have collected in your entire life, all of the assets you've ever gained in your entire lifetime, 2/3 are already determined by Allah. And nobody can change those. There are some mechanisms, and I'll go into that. There are some legal loopholes, as Islam has this for everything. There are rules in Islam, and there are always exceptions to rules. But generally speaking, 2/3 are apportioned by God in the Quran, and you cannot change those. And then Allah has given us the liberty of having 1/3 of our estate that we can determine where we want that to be spent. And again, I'll go into that as we go into deeper into this presentation. We have some further explanations of this. As we see that, in non-Muslim societies like Canada, where they don't recognize Islamic law, we don't have Sharia courts, we don't have maybe a mediation mechanism. Although I know Canadian law does accept mediation, arbitration based on religion. I know the Jewish community has it. There may be some aspects even in the GTA where Muslims have mediation services which are recognized by the Canadian court system. But generally speaking, they don't recognize our laws and our documentations per se in the way that we would draft it. And so, we obviously have to recognize that we need to have that will. If we lived back home in a so-called Muslim country, a lot of this would not be needed, at least the depth of it. Muslims still living in Muslim countries, they still have a need to write some document of their 1/3 or other obligations, but it would not have to be as, I would think, detailed or legalized in a formal setting as we have this need here in Canada. So again, another need for making sure we understand the process and putting this will together. So I know this question came up in one community I was at, and they said, well, I'm a Muslim, my wife is a Muslim, my children are all believers. Do I really need a will? Why don't I just, my kids know these are all my bank accounts and this is how much money I have, and they'll do the right thing. We would hope our spouse, we would hope our children would do the right thing when we die. But what reality is, brothers and sisters, that there is no guarantee in life. We don't know that today we may be following the path of Islam and the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon all of them, and our spouse may be on the same spiritual trajectory as us, but we don't know what will happen. They may decide to leave Islam, God forbid, or our children may decide to leave their religion. Right? So from a religious perspective, we have to make sure the will is written, because our heirs may not get what is entitled to them by Islam, or they may get more than Islam wants them to get, which is also problematic. And as Amir al-Mu'mineen said in that hadith we mentioned, that if you don't oppress people, then all of your rewards are as if you gave everything in charity. On the flip side, if you don't write a will and your inheritors are not given their rights, you are going to be held accountable by Allah on the Day of Judgment. Right? At least today, if I commit a sin today, I can go home and do tawbah. We can make istighfar, we can ask Allah for forgiveness. But if you don't write a will and then your spouse or your children are fighting over inheritance, then you're going to be held accountable on the Day of Judgment. And you can't come back to earth, come back to life and make amends and change things. So it's important from the religious perspective to ensure that the will is written, it's notarized, it's witnessed, all of the, as we say, you dot all your I's and cross your T's, so that everything is clear cut when you pass away. There's no ambiguity for your family to go into and have issues after the death of yourself. And then from the secular perspective, as I said, living in Canada, we're not governed by Islamic law. If you die without a will, you've died what they call intestate, which means that the court system, the secular non-Muslim court system that we live in today, will come in and determine what they want to do. And our legal expert can comment on that, how much they'll charge, how long that would take, what's that process look like. But I'm sure it would get very ugly. It would probably take a long time to sort out issues. And you keep in mind that as all that is going through, you're in your grave, potentially having to suffer and pay the consequence for not ensuring that you had taken care of your obligations when we had that opportunity. So again, it is important from both perspectives to make sure that we do the right thing. As I said, that intestacy rules, that when you don't have a will and you die, that every province will have rules that will be defined on how the estate's beneficiaries, how much they get, how long that process will take, how much it will take out of the estate. But that definitely would mean that all the inheritors would receive less than their share because it's going to be tied up in a court system. Right? So again, it becomes important even for that one aspect to make sure that a will is in place and that everything is done from the perspective of, again, the Canadian legal law and also the Islamic law. Another aspect, again, I'll look at this probably a bit later, in a bit more detail, but these, intestacy laws, they don't take into account any other intentions, right? For example, let's say you haven't performed the Hajj. Well, that's an obligation that has to come out of your estate. But if you didn't write a will and you didn't tell your spouse or your children, look, I didn't do Hajj, it was wajib on me, I couldn't make it for whatever reason, the Canadian government's not going to send a representative on your behalf to perform Hajj for you. Right? And so if you don't write that in your will, nobody will know about it. Right? Again, and that is now a debt you owe to Allah. And to pay debts to Allah is very difficult, right? Because now you're in your grave and there's nobody who knows that you didn't do Hajj, or now they don't have the money to go for Hajj or send somebody on Hajj on your behalf. Right? Or again, maybe you wanted to donate to this center, give a contribution for the center to flourish. That would never happen because, again, nothing was documented. So again, you leave this world without being able to actually articulate what you wanted to do with the money that you worked so hard for in your life to accumulate and save. It goes to the government, it'll go to legal fees, and hopefully your inheritors will receive something after all the legal costs are covered, but it won't be how much you wanted them to get, and things you wanted for them to do on your behalf may never get done for you. So as I said, and I just repeat this point, is that for some people it may become wajib, compulsory, to have a will, bearing in mind all of these consequences that I mentioned. Those are all in their own place, but I've broken down 5 reasons why I think we need to have a will living in Canada. It's to fulfill our missed religious obligations. As I said, your khums and zakat and any other charities and religious dues, these should be documented in your will. We make it a point in this will kit that we have to keep a space where you can put your khums date, the marja you follow, a breakdown of your bank accounts, which are khums paid, which are still liable for khums. Because even when you pass away, just as the government will come after your taxes, also we have to pay khums even if we pass away, right? If you pass away and you hadn't paid your khums for that year, your family needs to make those calculations. But if they don't know which marja you follow, they don't know what khums date you had, they don't know where your bank accounts are, then how do they fulfill that obligation for you? That comes through the will because you document all of that. Right? Missed prayers, fasting or Hajj, when we might miss our prayers and we think we'll make it up, but we forget. Or we become lazy and we don't make up our missed prayers, our missed fasting. Maybe Hajj became wajib on us, we never went. All of these things would not happen if we don't have a will documented to let people know. Right? So again, a will is not just about money and stuff where it goes. It's about our religious obligations to Allah, especially to make sure all of those are fulfilled and maintained. Reason number two why we need a will is to avoid any intervention and bureaucracy of the authorities. Again, a government will appoint someone to resolve the issues. We'll have a greater tax and legal implications, greater tax burdens when we don't have all of the paperwork done. And again, in our lifetime, we try to pay minimal taxes to the government. And so at the time of death, we also want to make sure that we're not paying more than we should, that we pay the minimum that we're required to by law. But if we don't have the will in place, again, that will have tax implications for our family having to deal with those. Another reason why we have to have a will is for have security and well-being of our surviving family members. Right? We may have an issue where legal inheritors may not receive anything or very little of what they're entitled to, and that they might actually need to have to live. Right? Maybe you have a spouse who doesn't work or can't work. Right? If you don't have a will, then if the government will step in and deal with things, or it gets tied up in the court system, this could be an issue. Or you may have people in your family that would not inherit from you, but you want to give them something in your will. Right? For example, you have a brother or a sister who might not inherit, or a nephew or an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent, or somebody outside of your family even that won't inherit legally, but you wanted to leave them something. You wanted to give them a memento, or you had, maybe our sisters have jewelry they wanted to give to a particular family member, or you have some special keepsake that's been passed on from generation to generation. You want to keep it within a certain family or a part of your family. Again, without the will, none of that will happen. It'll just be a free-for-all. People will take whatever they want and maybe dispose of the rest. Right? So the will serves that it will hopefully safeguard the security and well-being of your family, avoid any kind of disruption, arguments, disputes, and to keep that unity together, to keep the family united together. Another reason is that the wishes of the deceased would not be honored without a will. That 1/3, which I'll elaborate on, that would not be spent as you wanted it to be spent on. Any gifts of sentimental value, again, would not reach those who would be potentially enabled to inherit from you, or that you would want to write as a conditional gift. That wouldn't happen, so you would not be able to kind of direct where your wealth and your possessions go once you pass away. Acts of goodness and charity would not be performed, right? So aside from the religious obligations of khums and all of these other obligations we have, what if you want to donate a part of your estate to the religious center that you frequented, or to orphanages, or for widows overseas, or for any good charitable cause? Right? Again, the inheritors will take their money and live their lives, but whatever good you wanted to happen with your wealth, it just won't happen because there was no paperwork, there was no documentation of what you wanted to happen with your wealth after you leave this world. So another important reason is to ensure that all of those acts of charity which you wanted to happen with your excess wealth can be spent in the ways that you wanted. And one of the last points is jealousy against surviving family members, right? And this is not just a theory, this is actually, I've seen this in play out in real life where siblings, brothers and sisters, blood brothers and sisters have fought to the point where they no longer talk to one another. Families have literally split because a will was not made, and one of the brothers or one of the sisters who kind of had maybe more closeness to the parents and had access to the bank accounts and where the wealth was, they siphoned the money off and they didn't give it to their other siblings. And there have been cases where 8, 10, 12, 15 years these siblings are not talking to one another, right? Because of the fact that the will wasn't in place. Now that doesn't mean that a will is a surefire way to prevent this, but it's definitely a strong deterrent from any kind of misappropriation of the wealth. And again, we've seen this play out firsthand where siblings have gotten into arguments and they no longer talk to one another. And it wasn't for millions of dollars. Literally in a couple of examples we've seen, it was an inheritance in the estate of maybe $50,000 divided up into about 8 or 9 siblings. So they're only getting $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 each, which is not a lot of money in today's day and age. But over like $5,000, $6,000, they don't talk to one another anymore. Right? So we have to be cognizant of this, that these problems, again, I mentioned in the beginning that we think our spouse and children, that they're good and they're going to do the right thing. But believe you me, when it comes to money, people will change on a dime. Right? When you're talking about, especially estates nowadays, if you own a house in maybe London, if you own a house in the GTA, a multi-million-dollar home, right? People will kill over millions of dollars just like they kill over a couple of thousands of dollars. So hopefully, a will can prevent a lot of these things that I've talked about. Again, it's not a surefire, guaranteed, foolproof mechanism to avoid conflict and drama within a family or within the court system, but it's at least one of the preventative measures to, at least again, we're doing whatever we can to ensure that we don't have any of these disputes after our death. But then obviously it is, whatever will happen, but we try and mitigate all of the possible challenges by putting this will into place. And lastly, I think is, peace of mind, right? You're on your deathbed, maybe in a hospital, hooked up to machines, or maybe you're at home in bed or something. You don't want to have to worry and stress about your kids fighting over your money, or what's going to happen to mom, and what's going to happen to my parents, or whatever the case may be, right? There are examples of even children who have kicked the father out of the house. The mother passes away, and the children were taking care of the father in one case, an old elderly man, and the children actually kicked the father out of the house, right? And you don't want to be in those kinds of situations. Again, anything can happen. Even with a will, you can have family feuds and disputes, but you want to have that peace of mind that when you're about to pass away, you're on your deathbed, that you've done all you can, right? You don't want to have that stress and aggravation on you that have I covered all of my bases, right? And that's why, as I said, that, write your will today. And as life changes, you move into another house, you sell the house, you get new investments, you sell. Always be updating that document. Make it a living document that it gets updated maybe every 3 months, every anniversary. Pick a date and analyze the document and see where have I made changes, and adjust the document, in line with what changes are happening in your life. So obviously, we speed up to death now. Is an introduction. Now we go to death and what happens. So we all get that text message, that WhatsApp, right? That somebody has died in the community. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And we see somebody's name on that WhatsApp, and we realize, they're a friend of ours or family has left this world. So, it's really from that point forward when the person passes away, and eventually all of us in this room, that's going to be us. At one point, we're all going to be, today we're the recipients of WhatsApps. One day we'll actually be on that WhatsApp, and my name will be there, that, Salim Bhimji died today, right? And now what happens? What does that look like, right? You have to envision yourself now, right? As you passing away, look at it from two perspectives. One, as that you have now left this world, and now your family is all there. On one hand, they have to, get the ghusl and the kafan and the burial done. But at the same time, you've got all of this stuff around you, a home and a car and assets and bills to pay, maybe a mortgage to pay back. And then imagine it on the other side of the spectrum where your loved one has passed away, your mother or your father, let's say. And now you're having to deal with the entire estate. How do you wrap your head around everything that you have to do? Right? It becomes a very daunting task. So we're going to go through some of these aspects of what happens once death comes to us, or to our family member that we are directly and intimately connected to. So as we know, when we're alive, we all own stuff. We all have our home, let's say, or a car. We have our computers, our smartphones. We have our bank accounts. We have our investment portfolios. We have our RRSPs, all of this stuff that we all own right now. And as I say that this is my phone, this is my house, my car, right? All of this stuff is mine. But when I die, all of that stuff is no longer mine, right? It basically becomes being held in trust until it can be distributed to the people who are actually the rightful owners of it. So think of the will as being that document that tells your executors who's going to work through your will, who owns everything. The house is owned by this person. The car is owned by this person, right? My cell phone, my computer, my books, my everything everything has somebody's name engraved on it. Now you have to figure out who gets all of that stuff, right? When we were alive, the bank account was under my name. When I go to TD Bank, it says Salim Bhimji on the bank account. But when I'm dead, I no longer exist. So now how does TD Bank deal with that bank account, right? Or how does any bank deal with your money? That will has to cover a lot of this, or all of this, I would say. Right? The house I have, the title deed is under my name, let's say. But when I die, I'm no longer there to own that property. So now where does that house go? Right? The will is going to have to answer all of these questions. And that's where it becomes a very daunting task, because you have to begin to really inventory your entire life, everything that you have that has any tangible value. Not food in the kitchen or in the fridge or things like that, but anything that has value that could be sold and you can make some money off of it, technically has to be made noted in your will, because somebody has to get a percentage or ownership of that thing. So again, death, at the time of our death, everything gets transferred into a holding account, and then from there it will become distributed to all of those people that are entitled to inherit from us. And obviously in that list also is Allah, as we will see that Allah has a share in our estate as well. One of the things, before I go into more of the details, is about rights in Islam. Because we know that religion came with not just rules of praying, fasting, how to become, spiritually or physically purified. Religion is not just about those aspects. Religion, and Islam in particular, it also governs our social life. So within Islam, or within the religion in general, but Islam in particular, we have these discussions that many people also ask about, that why is it that between the divinely ordained rights that Allah, or the divinely ordained rules, we can even say in Islam, and the secular or socially constructed rules and rights, we sometimes see a contrast. Why is it that Islam says one thing, but our social system says something different? And the will is something like that. People will say, well, in Canada, when a person dies, for example, I'll give my own example, when I die, according to Canadian law, my wife will inherit my entire estate, right? And then she will basically do whatever she would like with it. And children will get a share, and so on and so forth. That'll be a socially constructed right. Canadian law, or secular Western law, has a system in place for who inherits how much and what do they get. In our system, the spouse gets everything. But Islam comes in and says, wait a minute, your secular, socially constructed rights are well and good for certain areas, but Allah says, I take precedent over your government's laws, right? For everything that we do in life, our religion should dominate. Right? Canadian society might say one thing, but we can say, well, that's all well and good for a secular society, for the majority who don't have a religion or God. But as Muslims, we have to say that the divinely ordained rights and obligations that God has put into place, those have to take precedent. So we will find, even in this discussion, that there are differences, right? Women will not inherit. Let's say that, let me reword that. Out of a husband and wife, when the husband passes away, the wife will not inherit everything, right? The woman will not inherit 100%. The husband will not inherit everything from his wife's estate. There are divinely ordained figures and rights which Allah has put into place. I don't think we have the time today to explain why, or even to go into a discussion why Allah has made differences between men and women. Not only at the physiological level, but at many levels there are differences between men and women. Right? Allah tells us in the Quran, وَلَيْسَ ذَكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى. The man is not like the woman. Men and women are vastly different. When it comes to the rules of religion also, we know that there are differences in many areas. Inheritance is one of them, and many times women, rightfully, they have a right to ask and question, why did Allah ordain inheritance laws in a certain way? And women may even say that, Islam is inferior because in the West, right, in Canadian law, the woman will get everything. And in Islamic law, a woman will get, let's say, a quarter. And they're right that there is a difference there between what the secular, socially constructed rights are and what the divinely ordained rights are. But we obviously have to go deeper and understand that Allah does everything for a wisdom. There's a purpose why Allah has done that. And we can't chalk it up and say, oh, it's the opinion of a male mujtahid or a male scholar, because these are ayat of the Quran where the rules of inheritance are being defined, that you can't chalk it up and say, oh, it's an interpretation of a hadith, or it's a hadith up for discussion. It's ayat of the Quran, so we have to accept it. But we can ask rationality. Was the Prophet or the Imams, were they ever asked why this difference exists? And we can find answers, hopefully. And ultimately, even if we don't find answers, we recognize that Allah does things for a purpose, a wisdom. But the beauty of Islam, as we will see, is that with the will, even those dynamics of how much the woman would inherit can be drastically changed. If the man, the husband, writes the will in the right way, keeping in mind maybe the needs of his wife if he is to pass away before, and maybe if he knows his children won't be there to support his wife, their mother, then the will can be used to completely alter the dynamics of how much the children would get and how much the wife would receive. So keep that in mind, brothers and sisters, that Allah has given us legal loopholes which can be used with no worry that we're breaking God's laws, and we can use these to change the situations when we write this document. So let me go to the meat and potatoes of the discussion. As I said, that when we die, everything is in a holding cell until it is distributed. Now, what is that holding cell? What is included within the parameters of that? So we use the term an estate. And the estate is basically defined as all the cash you have in your pocket, in your purse, in your wallet, at home, in the bank accounts, the actual liquid cash you can go and withdraw right now. It includes all your investments. Well, not all of them, sorry. There are certain exceptions to this rule, but RRSPs, your registered retirement savings plans, are in that. Your RESP, if you bought an educational savings plan for your children, that's still under the name of the person who put the money into that account. That also goes into your estate. You have GICs, you have your stocks, you have cryptos. If you are into cryptos and are not following a marja that says it's haram to buy crypto, then if you're investing in that, right, that's all a part of your estate. So it's not that you can just, deal with it on the side. All of those have real, tangible cash value. You can sell your stocks. You can sell and liquidate all your crypto. All jewelry, right, your watches, your rings, necklaces, etc., that have value to them, that's a part of the estate that has value. It has real worth, especially gold that our sisters have. Or maybe men are buying gold for investment purposes and it's in the form of jewelry. That has to be added as a part of the estate. You have cars, vehicles, maybe you have a boat, maybe you have other motorhomes, RVs. Anything that has value, as again, goes into that entire bucket called the estate. And anything, as we say, that has any monetary value, anything that you have at home or in your possession that has value is a part of the estate. So food, definitely not. Your clothing, unless you're wearing like an Armani suit or some expensive, purse or handbag or something that has, excessive value. Otherwise, our basic clothing, we'll probably just go to a Goodwill or go to charity when we die because it really has no value. Right? But anything at home that you can look at and say, that has value. I could go on Kijiji right now and sell it, or put it on eBay and get a couple thousand for it. If it has value, then that has to be made note of in your will. Anything that has no value, that obviously doesn't have to, it should still be discussed in the will, accounted for. Myself, I have a library at home of a few thousand books. They technically don't have value because I can't go and sell them really, right? But I mean, you could probably put them online and try and get a few dollars for them, but they don't have value, let's say, as much as a gold necklace would have or a ring. Right? So you have to determine in your own particular specific personal instances, what has value in my life? What has real cash value that I could actually sell? Or in the case of a family member, let's say my father passes away, what did he have at home that is his property that had value that he should be making a note of in his will? And if you find that things don't have value, then obviously it's not a part of the estate. It would be given away to charity or thrown off in the recycling bin, or you do whatever you need to do with that. So this is important to keep in mind, this definition of the estate. And there may be more things maybe that didn't come to my memory, but I think anything which has monetary value should be kind of that catch-all phrase for what belongs in the estate. So what's not a part of the estate? Property owned in partnership. Let's say you and your spouse bought a cottage up north in Muskoka, right? And you die. Well, she still owns, or he still owns half of that estate, or however much you agreed on the property. Or you have a business, or you and a friend in the community purchased a business, or you purchased a cottage and are time sharing, or you bought a boat and you split the cost of the boat, right? Anything that you don't own directly is not a part of your estate. The actual full value of it. It might have partial value, 30, 40, 50%. You'll have to make a note of that in your will, that I have, let's say, a cottage up north and I own 50% of it, so that can be obviously disposed of in the proper way. Or if you have cash or investments which are owned in partnership with your spouse or others, again, that would be not a part of your estate, so nobody's going to get that other than maybe that portion. And again, that would have to be figured out and ironed out in your will, how you would deal with investments that you have of other people. Or let's say you have somebody's cash. Somebody asks you, I have an amount of money I need for you to hold it for me for a while, and you have that in a separate account, and it's generating a return, right? You have to make a note of that in your will, that this money I'm holding is not mine, it's for a friend or somebody. And that's clearly noted in the will. And a life insurance policy is not a part of the estate. So again, I give my own example with my own life insurance policy. My wife is the beneficiary, so when I die, that entire sum doesn't go into the estate. It'll go directly to her. Right? So the life insurance policy for either the man or the woman, it's not a part of your estate. There's a beneficiary. It could be your spouse. It could be your children. Some people I've seen make maybe the religious center as a beneficiary, where you'll say, when I die, this life insurance policy goes to the Al-Mahdi center, let's say. It's very well possible to do. It's a very noble thing to do. If you have enough savings, your children and spouse don't need the money, then you give it to an organization. So that doesn't become a part of the estate. So that's important to also keep a note of mentally, and also that you make note in your will that you have a policy, you put the policy details, and that is not a part of the inheritance, so that people don't have any ambiguity when you pass away. So moving on, the division of the estate, as I've been saying, that there are divinely ordained rules. Allah has laid out who gets what. 2/3, the 67%, must be distributed according to the laws of the Sharia, according to the laws of Islam. And the 33%, the 1/3, are our absolute control. Right? So Allah has given us this real blessing, actually, saying that 1/3, as long as you write a will and tell people what you want to do with that 1/3, you have free reign to do pretty much anything you want with it. But 2/3 are hands off. You can't touch it, because Allah has already made that predetermination for us, where that 2/3 should go. So as an overall kind of understanding, again, without going into specifics, because each and every one of us will have our own unique dynamics of our spouse, how many children, who else will inherit. Generally speaking, these are the groups of people that would inherit from us, right? Our paternal and maternal uncles and aunts and their children as a last resort. Our grandparents, our siblings and their children would inherit as a last resort. Parents and children would inherit, and our spouse. So basically, the way that you can read this chart is that the spouse, which is in the largest letters, they are always going to inherit. As long as you're married to that individual, legally married according to Islamic law, your spouse will always inherit from you. There's never a time where they will not inherit. Unless they decide to apostate and leave Islam, then that's a different situation, and there's different dynamics for how a will would have to be formulated. But as long as the husband and wife are Muslims, a wife will always inherit from her husband, and the opposite also. The husband will always inherit from his wife that passes away. In that group also is the children and parents as well. As long as if your parents are alive, that changes the dynamics of the inheritance. Children, as long as they stay on the path of Islam, they're living. There are other exceptions, which obviously I won't go into, but children will also always inherit. And if you didn't have a spouse, let's say there's a husband and wife, both pass away, right? Let's say the husband passes away first and the wife is there, in her will, she would have to leave whatever she has to her. If her parents had passed away, her children would inherit. If she didn't have children, then It would go on to, let's say, her grandparents. If she didn't have grandparents alive, then her uncles and aunts or cousins. So ultimately, ideally, somebody within the extended family would inherit from a believer. If there's absolutely nobody left, a person passes away, they had no family members, and obviously, that would change, again, the dynamics of the will, and they would have to take account for that. And a will would look obviously much different in that kind of a circumstance. So this is one example which you can either go to the short link at the bottom, or you can scan this, and I'll make sure that the PowerPoint is available and emailed out so people have access to it. But this will take you to alislam.org. Maulana Rizvi has a book that he's also done on the will, and he highlights 36 different examples. Husband and wife with one daughter, with one son, with one daughter and son, with whatever combination you can think of, and he creates 36 possibilities and what percentage each person would get of that 2/3. So this is a great resource for those who have kind of a normal family, but most times Muslims don't have normal families. There's just one child. It's a large mixture of boys and girls, and other things are going on. So if you find that your example isn't there in the 36 examples, then you can go to this website. Again, you can scan the QR code. So this is actually made by one of our Canadian students who's studying in the holy city of Qum, in the seminary, Sayyid Ali Aqib Jafri. And so he's created a really actually amazing portal on this website, at least with the rulings of Sayyid Sistani and Sayyid Khamenei. And he maybe add to that, but it's also 4 or 5 languages. There's Arabic, Persian, Urdu, English, maybe French and Spanish as well, if I recall. But you just go through a series of questions. Are you the husband? Are you the wife? How many children you have, the gender of the children, your parents alive. You answer about 10 or 15 questions, and you'll get a complete breakdown of each percentage of every member of your family, how much they are entitled to get. So this is probably the best, I would say, online inheritance calculator. It'll give you every example that you have. And then you just have to kind of feed that data into your final will package with names and the percentages of everybody, and then kind of do your own breakdown and calculation. But this is definitely probably a very invaluable resource we have, because otherwise if you try to calculate it on your own, it becomes very difficult to do and very time consuming. And this one, within about 5 minutes, you'll have all of the details and answers that you need for your own specific situation. Moving on, I want to conclude in the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes, is we have something called a conditional gift within the will system. A conditional gift is basically where you gift anything to your spouse normally, or anybody really within your family, during your lifetime as a conditional gift, right? So for example, the condition could be, as long as my wife and I are married, I will give her possession of the house upon my death. Or she takes possession of the house from the Islamic perspective, because it's from the legal perspective, the spouse will automatically take over the house. But the religious perspective is different from the secular perspective. So the conditional gift would say, if I die or when I die, automatically the wife becomes the sole owner of the house from the Islamic perspective, right? Again, it's normally used for residential property, because the way that Islam works in general is that the house and the land are 2 separate things, right? Islam says the wife does not inherit the land. But you have a house in London, Ontario, you can't separate the house from the land, right? They're one, the structure is built on the land. But Islam says the woman does not inherit the land. She inherits the house, you can give it to her. So the conditional gift, as even Maulana Rizvi has mentioned, that this is that mechanism to use, that legal loophole, that you give the house as a conditional gift to your wife in the will. Upon my death, you are the owner of the entire house, the land and the house together Islamically, so that you avoid a lot of the drama that could happen. Or conditional gifting could be, as I said, example of jewelry, right? You may have a mother, a husband and wife, and they have, let's say, a boy and a girl, and maybe the mother wants to give the wedding jewelry that she got from her mother to pass it on to her daughter and that side, rather than her son's family, as an example, right? The mother could write as in her conditional gift in her will that upon my death, the jewelry, even though the son may be entitled to it because he gets the larger share, but I want that as a conditional gift to go to my daughter, right, and her family. So these kinds of things can pretty much be, almost anything can really be written as a conditional gift. Keeping in mind, brothers and sisters, that when we write the will, we don't want to also alienate our children. We want to make sure we are fair to them, both as sons and daughters, or multiple sons or multiple daughters, because we don't want to favor one over the other. Then when we pass away, they have arguments and fights and split with one another. So when you use the conditional gift, do it very sparingly with specific things, or do what I've seen other families and couples do, where if they have a son and a daughter and the mother has, again, I'll give the example of jewelry because this is a custom in many of our communities. The mother would give her daughter her jewelry set, is that she will give that to her daughter in her lifetime. She'll say, here, this is what you would have inherited. I'm giving it to you now to avoid any kind of problems later on. So that can also be thought of, to give gifts during your lifetime to your children or grandchildren to avoid any kind of further problems, down the line. So again, the distribution of the estate, once everything that what I defined as the estate, all those 5 areas are put together, that's your entire estate, and then that is to be divided. But before any division can go, before your 1/3 is set aside, before your spouse, before your children inherit, these things have to be kept in mind. That any legal debts you owe, you have a loan, you bought a brand new car, you have a loan from the bank on the car, you have debts, you have a mortgage. All of these need to be covered from your estate. Now, people might say, well, we bought $1 million home with a $500,000 mortgage. I don't have $500,000 in my estate. How am I going to pay off that debt? And obviously that will come to the dynamics of every family. Husband and wife may be paying mortgage bills directly or sharing the expenses, whatever that looks like. But just to give you the breakdown, that is all of our legal debts need to be paid before anybody inherits a penny. So you bought a new car, that's a debt you have. You borrowed money from a friend or from a family member, that has to be paid before anybody inherits anything. Religious debts, not only are legal debts obligatory, but our religious debts to Allah. Khums, zakat, if we have kafara, we hadn't fasted in Ramadan, we have the fidya to pay, we have kafara, we broke our fast intentionally. These have to be covered. Hajj was wajib and I just never went. I was too busy working, I was too busy doing this and that, or COVID came and shut the borders, we couldn't go, but Hajj was still wajib. Right? That Hajj continues to be wajib. So before your inheritors can take $1 from your estate, that Hajj has to be done. Now whether they go or you have it, somebody's hired to go for Hajj, that has to be paid. Right? That's a legal obligation we owe to Allah. The only exception here, which is covered in the 1/3, is missed fasting and salat. Our prayers are not a part of the legal debt, the religious dues. That's separate from the Hajj. Again, personal debts, you borrowed money from a family member, and also the wajib portion of our funeral. This is something that a lot of people I've seen in communities I've been to, from Halifax to Vancouver, a lot of people don't realize that my funeral should be paid by me. Right? I've seen it so many times, unfortunately, where people will come to the center and say, our father passed away, bury them now. Okay, well, who's going to pay for it, right? I think it's relatively cheap to be buried in London, Ontario, but I lived in Vancouver for 2 years with the community, working with the Azahra Center out there in Vancouver. It's costing right now over $20,000 to be buried in Vancouver at the low end of it. And if you want a grave at the top of the hill in the cemetery, the plot is $100,000. That's if you want a good view of the mountains and the ocean. It sounds silly, but it's true. The graveyard that the community uses in Vancouver, I think it's in Burnaby, I've been there. If you want a plot at the top of the mountain, so you get a nice view of the ocean, it starts at $100,000 for a graveyard plot up there. Right? It's a lot of money, but even the basic plots are $20,000 right now in Vancouver to be buried. So, as each and every one of us, we need to think about that. If the cost in London is, let's say, $8,000, I should keep aside that money in a separate bank account, maybe even as I'm growing up, as I'm 30 years old, right? Every year, just put a couple $100 into that, into that account. Save up and let your family know that this account is when I die, right? It's going to cover the graveyard plot. It's going to the cost to open the grave, to close the grave, all the costs that are associated with burial, government fees, transportation, so on and so forth. That's all obligatory on you as the individual. Right? When our family pay for it, or in an instance where a community can't, where the family can't and the community pays for it, that's well and good. But ultimately, it's my obligation to pay for my own death. right? I should be saving my own money. I should go, when I go for ziyarah, that's why I encourage you, when you go for ziyarah, buy your own kafan. It's only $5, $6, $10, $20 to buy a kafan from Najaf or Karbala, but keep that with you, right? And incidentally, we actually have hadith, when you buy a kafan and you keep it, Allah will actually extend your life. There's actually thawab, there's merit in having your own kafan. Allah says, you're preparing, I'm going to let you live longer. Right? Some people think it's kind of macabre. I'll go to ziyarahs and I'll come back with a kafan for mom and dad as a gift. I want a tasbih or a turba as a gift. I don't want a kafan. But it's rewarding to give a kafan as a gift. And hadith tell us, just as a side note as I move on, that when you buy a kafan, don't be cheap. Buy the best clothing you can buy, the best cloth. Hadith tell us on the day of judgment, when we come out of our graves, we'll be boasting that we had a nicer kafan than the guy beside us. We say, he's got an Armani suit, he's got a Gucci, she's got, I don't know, this kind of shoes or purse. We're going to be boasting to one another that we have a nicer kafan than the other person. So don't think, okay, I'm going to bargain with this guy in the market in Najaf and get a cheaper kafan, No, spend the most money, spend extra money and buy a good quality, because that's what you're going to be raised with on the day of judgment, right? And so you want to look your best, right? When we go to a dinner function, we want to look our nicest. So when we go in front of Allah on the day of judgment, we should look as nice as we can as well. Have a nice kafan, spend the extra few dollars on that. So these expenses have to be covered before inheritance goes to anybody. Again, we go that 3366 division. The 1/3 I want to look at very quick. That has to be, or that can be used rather, and that's why the will is important, because in your will you can make a note that out of your 1/3, your missed prayers. Right now, all of us, if we miss salat, and I'm sure we all kind of miss every now and then, we might sleep in, we will forget. We should try our best to make it up while we have the time, but we should write in our will, and again, even in this book, we have a spot where you can make a note of how many years of fasting you've missed, how many years of praying you've missed. Make a note of that, right? As of now, from contacts that we have overseas in the house of Qum, it's around $300 to $500 a year for fasting. Fasting and praying is about $700 to $1,000 for 1 year of making up missed praying. So it becomes expensive, especially if you've missed praying for 5 or 10 years, right? That's like 10, 15, 20,000 right now, and as the years progress, it becomes more and more expensive. Fasting is also very expensive. So try to make up as much as you can, but if you can't, then obviously you need to keep a lot of money aside. Charitable purposes, you want to build or maintain Islamic centers, propagation of the faith, humanitarian efforts to widows, orphans, humanitarian causes. All that 1/3 can be put into that. Giving to needy relatives or friends that don't have a share in your estate. Again, you might have family members, cousins that won't inherit under general circumstances, but they helped you out in life. You want to give them something bonus. Make sure you note that in the will. Or relatives that would get less, right? Your daughter may get less in her inheritance. If you have, let's say, a son and a daughter, the son would get double the amount of the daughter. But you want your daughter to get more because maybe the son has a good job and whatever, or just you want your daughter to get more. The 1/3 can be used in those instances to give her more, or give your wife more, or anybody within the family. This is just one example, right? So person passes away with a total of estate of $100,000. We take out $10,000 for their funeral expense. We take out $30,000 for their personal loans and debts they had. We take out the 1/3 they wanted to spend for their own goodness, that's $20,000. In general instances, the wife would receive $5,000, the son would get $23,000 and change, and the daughter would get $11,000. But then that $20,000, that 1/3, right, this 1/3 of personal usage, you could easily flip around and say, well, there's $20,000, I want my wife to get it. So now she gets $25,000 instead of $20,000. Or you might say, well, I want my daughter to get it. So she would get $31,000 instead of her $11,000. Right? Or you want to say, I'll keep 1/3 for my missed praying and fasting, and the rest can go to my wife. Whatever you want to do, right? How a person wants to play with the numbers. But when you use that 1/3, you can see that you can kind of use it for personal usage, or you can give it to a family member. But you can see how that would change the dynamics of who gets what and who gets how much of the estate. Right? So that can always be, those numbers can shift. That 1/3 could be 5,000 you keep, and the rest of the 15 goes to inheritors. You can determine where that money goes to. So a few more points and we'll conclude with this. Some other things to keep in mind, especially living in the era that we live in today. And some other fiqh rules is, according to all of the Maraji Taqleed, the Quran, the ring, and not applicable today, but the sword of the deceased and the clothing worn by the father is the right of the eldest son. So the eldest son gets a lot of the perks. He gets the father's Quran, the ring. Most people don't have swords today. Maybe if you have a 9mm or one of these, right, then then the son might get those. But clothing, this is going back at the time of the Prophet in that era where, people had swords because you had battles, right? The clothing was kind of the mark of the man. Right? Nowadays, the clothing will just go to Goodwill probably, right? So the son gets all of that. But keep in mind, the son also has some responsibilities and obligations, which I'll touch upon. So one of the obligations of the eldest son is that it is wajib upon him to make up all of the missed prayers of his father. So he might get the ring, he might get the Quran, he might get all of that, but he now has to do as an obligation all of the salat that the father missed under certain conditions. So if the father didn't perform salat because he just didn't care about praying, he's like, I don't care about salat, what's this, then the son doesn't have to make those up. So it's not that, he has to. No. If the father didn't care about salat, then the son doesn't have to worry about it. Or if the father says, I'll keep the money aside and I'll hire somebody to do it, don't worry about it, to his son, then the son is absolved of that obligation. Then it's better that he does it, but he can go the route of the father and pay somebody to perform that salat for the father. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, the scholars mention that if the eldest son knows that the father had missed prayers but didn't know if he had performed them or not, then as Sayyid Sistani at least mentions that as an obligatory precaution, the son has to perform them. But if a person makes the will that somebody should be hired, then the son does not have to perform them. So again, there is that also legal loophole that the scholars give, that it doesn't always become an obligation for the son to have to make up the prayers. Moving on, as we conclude, we have a term that is used, which is executor for the masculine or executrix for the female. And this is basically somebody who's going to be executing your will, right? Again, so I said the example myself, I wrote this, I filled this in for myself, I pass away tomorrow. Whoever I ask and agrees to be the executor, they'll have to take this book and follow every single page out of the 60 pages in this book. So if I say I had 10 years of salat missed, they're going to have to figure out, okay, how much does it cost? Who does it? How do I get the money to that organization? And they're going to have to do all of that. Right? I say I didn't do Hajj. They're going to have to find a group that goes for Hajj that they can hire, pay them that money from my estate, and do all of that stuff that's in this book. So the executor becomes very important because that person, man or woman, will be fulfilling all of the last wishes of the deceased. And it becomes daunting if you want to think about it. Like just the other day, my wife and I were discussing this, right? We just walk around our modest house in Kitchener, and we were thinking if both of us were to pass away at the same time, that leaves my daughter to do everything in this book. So she has to sell the house if she doesn't want it. She has to sell my thousands of books or get rid of them. She has to take all my clothes and give and donate them. Look at everything in the house that you own today when you go home and think, if I was to die today, who's going to take care of all of this stuff? Either sell it or throw it away. Who's going to go to the bank and close all my bank accounts and take all the cash and put it in one account? Who's going to make sure my bills are paid until everything is sorted out? Who's going to sell the car? Who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? The executor, that's their job, right? That's literally their voluntary job to do everything that you want them to do when you die. So you have to make sure that you talk to people that you trust, minimum of 2 people that are trustworthy, that have the time, that have the ability, that really love you enough to want to go through all of that challenge to fulfill your last wishes. It's not an easy thing to do if you think about it. Again, you just walk, when you go home tonight, just walk through your house and do a rough inventory of what you have in life. And then think, when I die, somebody has to take care of all of this stuff for me. Who is willing to do that? It's huge, but we have to do it, right? We live in this society. We live, very good lives. Alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed us living in Canada. We have so much stuff. But with all of that stuff comes responsibility. A guardian for minor children. If you have children under the age of 18, do you want to suggest to the courts who will take care of your children? Or do they become a ward of the state and go into a non-Muslim family, God forbid, as orphans? Right? So you have that, right? It might, obviously that's legal implications, so I don't want to touch on that, but you can make a note in your will of who you want to be guardians of your underage children. But it's something to think about, right? And once your children become of age, you can remove that from your will. As I said, it becomes a living document. But make note of it now if you have children. And then as they grow, mature, change those details in the will. Another thing we cover in this book is social media and email, right? Our lives are on social media today. Do you want your spouse to take over all your emails and your Facebook and your TikTok and your Instagram account and see all the stuff that you posted that they didn't know about? I probably don't want that to happen. So what do you do with all your accounts, right? Because either they just sit there, or do you want your accounts all shut down? Or do you want your spouse to maintain your Facebook or your TikTok profile or your email accounts, right? So you have to remember that passwords have to be documented, has to be put somewhere where everybody that your inheritor can access it. Don't forget your bank accounts. So you have a PayPal account, you have online banking with virtual banking. There's no branch that you can walk into. So do you have all those passwords noted and what your login credentials are, right? That all has to be documented again. This wasn't needed 20 years ago, right? But today our lives are so virtual and online that all of this needs to be clearly documented to make sure that you don't miss anything. And if you have a business, then it becomes all the more of a challenge, as I'm even dealing with today with my own businesses. How do I account all my business expenses and the money coming in, and where does that go, and what happens to my inventory? That has to be documented so your inheritors know that shut down dad's business or shut down mom's business, sell the assets, where does that money go, who gets the assets from the business? All of that has to be kept in the forefront of our mind. Organ donation is a huge issue as well, right? We want to do good, and especially the new generation want to donate their organs, but is it allowed? So I'll give you just 3 examples. So Ayatollah Sistani doesn't recognize organ donation at all. And so he says if you follow him, he doesn't allow anybody to donate any of their organs. Blood now is obviously okay while you're alive, but when you die, no organ donation, according to his ruling, from what I know of the most current rulings of, let's say, about a year or 2 ago when I originally put this PowerPoint together. As far as I know, it hasn't changed. So he doesn't allow organ donation at all. Ayatollah Khamenei, he does. He actually allows unconditional, as long as they don't mutilate the body completely when they take the organs out. He's fully okay with organ donation. There's no problem with it. So complete, difference of opinion. One says haram, one says completely permissible. So you have to find out who you follow, and if you would like to donate your organs, you need to obviously make that note of that in your will, not only on the organ donor card you might get in the mail or on the back of your license or the paper portion, but you should put that in the will document as well. And let your family know, because obviously that has to be done, immediately after death, right? Those organs have to be given, so there's something to think about over there as well. And also I put Ayatollah Nassim Makarim that he allows it, again, provided you have express intention in your will for organ donation. If you follow any of the other Maraja, please do confirm what their rulings are, because again, there are so many different scholars out there with different rulings. Living will is something to keep in mind. Basically, it means that if you become ill or incapacitated, you don't have the ability to speak, to go to the bank, you're in a coma, who's going to take care of all of the treatment you get, right? What if a family member says, let's just pull the plug on him. He's not going to make it. We're just going to, what they call DNR, do not resuscitate, right? Let them just pass away, right? So you have to have a living will that will clearly articulate your medical instructions and what's to happen if you're on a life support machine. You don't want your children to make the decision of pulling you off of the machine and you dying, because that has religious implications for an individual. So a living will should cover that. Again, you should talk to your lawyer about that, and talk about with your religious scholar, local religious scholars. Your family members, your family physician should know what your wishes are, because they should play a role in all of this. Power of attorney is important in your will. That's a person that would basically be in charge of a lot of your affairs. If you have a stroke and you can't speak, right, but you have bills to pay, and maybe you don't have another family member to go into the bank and get your money out or transfer money, who's going to pay the bills while you're in a coma or on a machine? So you have to have power of attorney that gives them the right to go and withdraw money and deal with your bank. Again, that's all also as a note to keep in mind. As we conclude, we have funeral arrangements. Do you want a particular scholar to lead your Salatul Mayyit, your Janazah? Do you have somebody specific to give you the ghusl? Maybe you want a family member to be there. Salatul Mayyit, the kafan. Do you own your own kafan? Where is it? You have to make a note of that. Do you own your own burial plot here in London or in Toronto? Do you want to be buried there? Or what if you go back home for vacation and you die there? Do you want your body to be flown back to Canada? Do you want to be buried there if you die in Ziyarat or Umrah or Hajj? Do you want to be buried there? All of these have to be thought about again and made note of in your will to make sure that all of these are taken care of. So you're not leaving your family to guess what you wanted to have done with your body when you pass away. And obviously, we all want to ensure that our journey, just as we try to make our life in this world comfortable and easy, we have a nice house, we have a nice car, we want to enjoy our life in this world. I'll end with this in saying that the will is the way to ensure that our life in the world to come is also easy, that the will becomes that mechanism to make sure that our next home, which is our grave, is comfortable, and that we have not wronged anybody and that we have not taken anybody's rights in the time that we have left this world, that we have given everybody their rights as well. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. That brings an end to the presentation. At least I guess we can start with the Q&A session from now. And I'll let you moderate that.
Okay, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So great presentation, probably one of the most applicable ones that we've had in the center. Can speak for everyone to say that it's very good, very informative, and I know myself personally, I was a bit ignorant to some of these things, and I think my blood pressure is pretty high after this as well, unfortunately. But for the next portion of the day, I'm going to introduce one of our brothers who is a lawyer working out of Toronto, Brother Mudassir Rajab Ali. Just a short introduction about him. He graduated from law school at the University of Windsor and has been since working over in Toronto. He's currently specializing in more of the insurance matters with civil litigation as well. So please, with a large or loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, please welcome him up to the podium as well. And then feel free, any questions, or I will get us started with a few that I had in mind as well.
Can you please confirm, did you say that the life insurance policies are not considered part of the estate?
Correct, yeah, life insurance policy is not a part of the estate, it's separate. So it goes directly to the beneficiary. Yes.
But what about other bank accounts and so on that you have beneficiaries listed to? Like, how do we differentiate?
So technically speaking, from the Islamic perspective, the bank account would belong to the person who basically owns the money in that account. So let's say if a husband and wife have a joint account, if they have an agreement between the two of them that we share the assets in this account 50-50, right? Then at the time of death, then let's say the husband dies, only half of that money in the account is the wife's property. The other half would go into the husband's estate. If the account is owned by just the one spouse, that would be part of the estate then. Yeah. So it depends on the agreement that the spouses have. If it's a joint account, if they, again, whatever percentage they're agreeing upon in sharing that money, and any personal accounts would be owned by that particular spouse.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify something. Assalamu alaikum. A life insurance policy is between the policyholder and the applicant. So in this case, it would be the person who's making the will or is deceased at that point, unfortunately. So that contract is specifically between those two parties. So if that's the case, then no other party is involved unless you've named a beneficiary or dependent, which confirms what Sheikh Salim is saying. In other cases, in exceptional cases, you might have a policy that involves both spouses or dependents or beneficiaries together. And in that case, it does form part of the estate altogether, okay? Sorry, as well. Yeah, so RSPs are different in terms of when it comes with taxes. So is it a government pension or is it private pension? Like, Yeah, so employment, so usually you'd have an account with that pension and you'd be able to name a beneficiary or dependent. So yes, so that's again, that's between that third party insurer and you as a person. So that's a private contract altogether. Okay. When it comes to RSPs, for example, I would advise always making a will to transfer the RSPs on death. So per the will, when the will crystallizes on someone's death, to the person's spouse. And the reason why I say that is because you would actually exclude, or you would have like a tax ruling or a deduction, and so that is deferred in that case. On the contrary, if you do an RSP and you assign it to a child or your children altogether, they actually have to pay taxes to get the RSPs from you when you die, right? Something like TFSA, tax-free savings account, which you probably have through your TD or Scotiabank, that is something that you would want to assign to your child or your children because that's tax-free. You can do that, okay? So those are just some legal loopholes. I guess not loopholes, but some legalese that you would want to know about.
In terms of writing the will,
Yeah.
are we, like, if we use, for example, the website from Sayyid Augustine to actually follow
Sure.
all the questionnaire to create a document, is that document, when I get two witnesses signed, is that legally binding, or do I need a lawyer on top of that to
Yeah.
certify it?
Yeah, so the simple answer is you don't need a lawyer to make a will. So you don't actually need someone like me to make a will. By the way, I'm not here in any business sense. I'm actually here because Brother Samer is practically like family to me, so he invited me here. Yeah, so in terms of witnesses, you can't have a beneficiary as a witness. So you would actually have to have independent witnesses who are outside of the beneficiary or even dependent system. By beneficiary system, I mean the people who are your children, your spouses, someone who's benefiting from your will or your estate or your trusts altogether, whatever you're creating in that sense. There are two types of wills in Canada. So electronic wills are not, sorry, in Ontario. Electronic wills are not valid in Ontario, in the province of Ontario. The only province that has just recently, because of the pandemic, validated electronic wills is the province of British Columbia. In Ontario and any other province, you would have to have wills that are typed out and then signed or executed by wet ink, right? In certain cases, you have something called a holographic will. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. A holographic will is something where a person has made a will on their own, in their own handwriting, and typically this happens right before when a person passes away, which creates a lot of contention and problems in court. And in that case, you don't need any witnesses, but there's a lot of contestation for that sort of a will. And we can get into that if someone has a question about that. Sure, go ahead, sister. So I practice for an insurance defense institute in Toronto for the past 5 years. So over the course of my practice, I've seen how contestation of wills interpretation, and probate law have carried out in court. It's not the greatest, which is why I actually encourage all of you to actually draft a will if you're over the age of 18, or if you're planning to go to Hajj, or you have a problem in the family, or something has happened. I don't personally practice wills, but I practice in litigation. So that means when something becomes litigious, which hopefully it doesn't, then I take it up to court and we argue it for both sides or all sides, and we see what happens with that. That being said, I do have referrals for wills. If you do require a lawyer for special expertise, then I can always guide you and advise you on that. Yeah.
Question about, so I know a bunch of family members may have wills drafted in like other countries.
Right.
So what point legally does that apply here in Canada?
Yeah, so that's a very deep question. So in Ontario, in the province of Ontario and other provinces of Canada, we follow the common law, which is derived from the British court system, right? Way back in the 1700s, Lord Denning. In other parts of the world, for example, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, East Africa, Tanzania, where I'm from, those wills are not applicable or valid or enforceable in Canada, right? So if you have properties in other parts of the world besides Ontario, even if in a different province, you would have to get probate, meaning a will for that particular province or country, applicable particularly to that law over there. Okay, so you can't make you can't apply a law from Lebanon or Iraq or Iran in Ontario. It's not going to work. Sorry, go ahead, Uncle.
Mhm. No, the conditional gift does not have to be within the 33%. It can be outside of that amount as well. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, if you want to donate your organs, you follow Sayyid Sistani, can you do taba'i, then follow Sayyid Khamenei? I think it's a bit of a contentious issue, although I know Ayatollah Sistani does allow taba'i if you believe another marja to be at the same level of knowledge as him. From what I've seen of his general rulings, that he allows general taba'i. Taba'i basically means to follow another marja in any other issue. From the general rulings I've seen, he seems to allow it. I haven't seen in specific in this area, but generally he does allow it. So if he allows it generally, I don't think there would be a problem with it in this specific instance. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question like about the mortgage. Like you said, like when the person will die, that means the state will, for with the mortgage that it's the spouse, like they have like portion, like half half. So the half of the person who died, that means the state will like take over.
Correct. Yeah.
So in this case, let's say that's my question. My question, if I want like, if I would like to make like my will.
Mhm.
In this case, how I will divide it? Like I will go through the instead to as a standard one. So I will go with the like 1/3 and 2/3. Divide it how is it? Because after that to not to sell the house, like to keep everything as a family,
Yes.
like pay whatever
Yeah.
the mortgage payment, and they will live in the same house.
Yes.
Don't want like to divide the family. That's my question.
Yes, so with the house, it becomes more of a challenge. So basically, generally speaking, the way that the Islamic rules work is that, and I think even within the family dynamics, it might be different, because I think for most cases, a husband and wife, let's say a husband and wife are working and both earning money, they're both paying towards the mortgage. So technically, in those examples, they own the house 50-50. In other instances where, let's say, the husband, the mother or the wife stays at home, and let's say she has her own income, but she's not contributing to the mortgage or the house, in those examples, the husband would be the sole owner of the house, technically from the Islamic perspective. So this is where there has to be one, we have the conditional gift as an option, where if the husband is the sole owner of the house and paid for the mortgage, so that's one area that we should try and use, is the conditional gifting. So the husband would say, I've bought the house, I've paid the mortgage, and as a conditional gift, he would make it known that on his death, the wife owns the house as a conditional gift. Then there also has to be kind of that understanding among the family against the children and especially the children and other inheritors, that the house it has value, but at the same time it's also where the family lives, right? Because the children have to realize we can't just force mom to sell the house and then we live in an apartment or something, right? I saw this happen recently, actually, one of my trips, where husband and wife, they had a few children. The father passed away, and unfortunately, because of the way that the particular culture of this family was, the son, he basically was kicking his mother out of the house to sell the house to take his money out of the house. So, at one level, yes, the will hopefully address that, but also this is, that was an area of akhlaq and, Islamic adab, that, how can a son kick his mother out of the house because he wants a few $1,000s from the house? So I think, at one level, I think the will should be there from the religious perspective to ensure that if the husband passes away, that as a conditional gift that he gives the wife the house, and it's from the religious perspective her property, so that there is no issue of having to sell it to give the money to the other inheritors, the children, let's say. I think that's probably the one way that could be used to make sure that the house would stay within the family, that they wouldn't have to sell it to give any money to anybody at that point. But there's also the legal perspective, right, of the ownership of a house at the death of the man.
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. According to the Family Law Act and the Divorce Act, if there's spouses, they're living in the same house, even if the husband's paying the mortgage and all the expenses, it's still halved. It's still 50-50%. If you were to divorce right now, half of the property would still go to the wife, right? And if you have minors, then that's more of a story for her to take 50%, or vice versa. It could be the husband as well, right? So it goes both ways. Not that women or men are bad or whatever. It's nothing like that. I did want to touch some points on power of attorneys and living wills. So living will is synonymous with a power of attorney. When we talk about POAs, which is the acronym POA, you have a power of attorney for personal care or a power of attorney for property. The power of attorney for personal care is someone who, at the time of me living, I haven't died yet, for example, has the full capacity to control my medical expenses, my rehabilitation, my therapy, things of that nature, okay? A power of attorney cannot control children, and an estate is not defined having a children within an estate, right? So a child is not an estate, nor is a spouse, right? So beings are not part of an estate. Only cash, something that's monetary of value, is part of an estate. Power of attorney for property is someone that takes care of my property. You could have the same power of attorney who takes care of the personal care and the property. That is possible. So where exactly do you need a lawyer? You need a lawyer when someone dies, and that is when a will is crystallized. So when a will actually comes into life. If my dad is living right now, and which he is, and he has a will, and in that will he owns 2 or 3 properties. And if I call the Land Titles Ministry office and I say, I want this will to take into effect because the will says that I'm the beneficiary of a property, I'm the sole beneficiary of this particular property, and I want it in my name. Can I do that? No, I can't. That will is not enforceable because the person's alive. He has to die for me to make that enforceability as an active status, right? So those are some important things to take care of. So the POAs always go before death, and at death is when the will applies. When you don't have a will, and these are some premises in negation that we should apply, and they should hopefully encourage everyone to go out and get their own wills sorted or get their documents in order and not do a lot of tax fraud, which is a joke, right? So let's do some premises that are in negation. If I don't have a will, what happens? It means that I die intestate. Intestate means that someone has died without a will or without having made any sort of oral valuation of money or division of property or who takes care of the kids, the minors, nothing. This person has not done anything of that nature. Okay, what happens with that person? Well, the state basically comes in, right? The province of Ontario, the common laws kick in, and they say that a third of the entire estate will go to the living spouse, if the person has a spouse. 2/3 of that valuation, of that trust, of that estate, will go to the beneficiaries, meaning the kids, the children, if he has children, which is in direct opposition to Islam and Sharia law, which is what you saw today. Because technically speaking, we only have 1/3 of our own choice, right? So you have 1/3 per the common law. If you don't make a will, they'll take care of everything else. And according to Islamic law, you only have 1/3 to dispose at your own behest, at your own convenience, right? So that's why it's important for us to get that will sorted, especially if you're going for, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, when you say the third, so let's say in respect to the allocation of assets with that third, can you designate percentages? So let's say you have $50,000 left over. Can you be like, I want 5% of that to go to X, 7% of that to go to Y, until you eventually disperse that fund completely?
Sure, so long as everything is in your name, right? If you're living in a property and you might be the sole owner on title, but your spouse is living with you, well, she's basically the co-owner of that property, right? So you have to be careful. We're talking about direct contracts between the husband and the wife that literally say, with the exception of this property is solely mine, right?
Oh, so there would need to be a written contract.
Yeah, those have to, like for example, when you go off and you get a mortgage, your spouse would have to consent to that mortgage at all times. You could get 100 mortgages, but if you're married, legally married, she would have to, or he would have to consent to every mortgage that you.
It was gone before marriage, but then after you did get married, then does she then need to sign off to that or no?
She doesn't have to sign on to that mortgage, but because that property increases and appreciates in value, she has a stake or they have a stake in that property ultimately, right? Upon death or upon separation or upon divorce or whatever happens. Okay.
If somebody writes a will like 15 years ago, and their like status has completely changed. So we're talking like different assets and everything. One, is that will still applicable? And two, what do you do with the new assets?
Yeah, so that's a little complicated again, which is why we always say to update the will as you go on. And by the way, when you do write your will, you want to make sure that you have 2 executors named. So you have one executor who can carry out the will. But if the first executor says, no, I simply don't want to carry out this will, at least there's a second executor. You also have, in situations I've seen, you have 2 executors that are fighting over power, right? Because also it's in their best interest. They might be a beneficiary as well. They might be a dependent, they might be a child, they might be a spouse. In that case, you would have to have a conflict of laws clause inserted in your will, which basically says, if there's a conflict between the 2 executors, this is what's going to happen, right? I don't know if that answered your question that well, but if there's a will that's made 15 years ago and circumstances have now changed, well then that can invalidate that will. So if you die, you basically have died intestate. That's what it's given.
So, I mean, religiously, the will would still be applicable, but obviously it would be outdated. So, again, things like the 1/3 option would not be there. That would be the biggest thing, because, I mean, let's say from person gets, at one point they write their will, 15 years later they pass away, they didn't update the will. Let's say in that time they got married, they had children, whatever. Those percentages of what the children or the spouse would get would be determined by Islam anyway. So they would just lose out on that 1/3 if they had not written it 15 years prior. So really it would just be that personal, the one area would be that personal 1/3 would not be accounted for if they hadn't drafted that part 15 years back or in the past. Yeah. But the rest of it would still be applicable. So, yes? Mhm. Yes. So, so once so all the obligations, like for example, if there's missed khums or the Hajj, all of those and other expenses would have to be covered first. But then the conditional gift portion would come into play. Would I would say come to play after that, because still all the religious obligations and legal obligations have to be covered, right? So those any debts or mortgages that would be fulfilled, and then. Before the 1/3, I would say that's where the conditional gift would be. That part would be kind of executed at that point. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, so I think I would have to say that there would be limitations with the conditional gift in that sense, because those legal inheritors still have that share legally, right? So they would still get their share of the inheritance from the estate, whatever is there, and then other than that could be a part of that conditional gift from outside of that, though. Yeah, yeah. You mean if you get a conditional gift, if you have to accept it, or? Mhm. Yeah, that's optional still. It's optional, correct, yeah. Yes. Mhm.
No, it doesn't have to be notarized. You're only going to be bringing in a lawyer for notary or a commissioner, which can also be a lawyer or a paralegal, depending on their status, when you have an affidavit of execution coming in, which only comes in when you want to make sure that the will was actually signed and was valid. So that's when someone is contesting or challenging a will at court. Anyone can challenge a will at court, by the way. Literally anyone can. And it goes through something called a probate and an assessment of that will. Once it's valid, its validity has gone through the court system, and as a judge has endorsed that will, then that can be executed then.
Okay, and you said the online forms like WillPro or other companies in Ontario, those are not legal in Ontario?
No, I'm not saying they're not legal. I said they can be perfectly legal so long as they follow common law, but you have to sign the forms with wet ink. So you can't sign it electronically, right? So you can't sign it on DocuSign or Adobe Acrobat or whatever we use. You can't do that. That doesn't work for a will.
And if we fill out like what the Sheikh was saying with breaking down everything in this book, can this be considered a will? We can sign it and consider that a will?
So I don't think there's a sample will in here specifically, is there?
Yeah, the whole thing is basically the sample will. So,
Okay, yeah.
and then you
So,
do have the
so I mean, you would have to dumb it down. So there is a sample will online by Sayyid Rizvi, and that goes through the actual clauses because the clauses have to be in there. And I can go through the clauses and explain why those clauses have to be in there. This is all the topics within the wills and trusts and estates. So this is a good guidebook to have, okay? But if I was to go and fill everything out and say, this is my will, probably not. And the reason why is because there's some clauses in here that are not in here that should be in here, okay? Yeah. No, you'd have to read it and know what's going on with the will and what the person's intentions are because you could be called for it, yes. Okay, yes. Sorry, I didn't get your question.
How often should you update the will through the lawyers?
Oh, I think like every year, if you can. Every year at least. You don't have to go to a lawyer every year. You could have a basic will that's made, and then you could update it as you go along. On your own respect, yes. So long as it makes sense and so long as it's valid and per common law, then it's fine. The idea being you want to print out the will, you want to make sure that there are two independent witnesses that are not beneficiaries that sign the will in wet ink along with yourself, and that you store it in a space where someone can find it. So not like in a bunker somewhere, right, where no one can find it. That's not going to work, right? So the recommendation is to have at least 2 or 3 wills around your property or somewhere where something happens to you, a child or your wife, or someone can find it somewhere. That's the whole point of it. I didn't catch your question.
income tax on the beneficiaries for a life insurance policy.
Income tax for beneficiaries? I don't understand the question.
Like if a person passes away, their life insurance goes, let's say, to the beneficiary, like the spouse, let's just say.
Yes.
Do they pay tax on that, income tax?
They could, yes. It's part of capital gains.
Khums, as far as I remember, yeah, on inheritance, there's no khums. So, for example, whatever amount you inherit from any family member, there's never any khums on that money. If you keep it for 30 years, never khums. But life insurance, if it wasn't used within the year, yes, there would be khums on that savings. So there is that difference to keep in mind, that for inheritance, there's never khums payable on it, whether it's jewelry or properties or cash, there's never khums on it. But for life insurance policy, if that was on the death and it goes, let's say, to the spouse or the beneficiary, there would be khums on that. Yes. If it's not used within the year, correct. Yes.
We'll take another 2 questions before we have to start wrapping up for Salah. We do have a
With the sister behind your, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Like with life insurance, we'll go to the beneficiary. So this is like the state will not like take over. Yes, we know that, but Islamic like religious like feel like we need like to divide it, like they people.
No, so the,
So
No, so for the life insurance, whoever was the beneficiary named in the life insurance would have ownership of that. And yeah, so Islam would recognize that. So if it was the wife, the beneficiary, or the child, whoever it was named, they would have, that would be their owner on that. Yes. Okay. So I didn't get the full question. Okay.
Like, are they adopted? Did you adopt them by sponsoring them?
Oh, okay, got you. Yeah, yeah. So were you sponsoring the orphan and you're paying like a yearly thing for them? Good question. I would think that there should be some, I mean, like, for example, I think if a person is sponsoring an orphan, like through one of these nonprofit charities, they should probably make a provision in their will that when they pass away, if that child is still within that project of being sponsored, that they should try to continue those payments. Because there is a certain, I think, legal obligation. I know some of the Maraja even mentioned that if you're sponsoring these orphans, you are even obligated to pay the zakat al-fitr for them. So there is a kind of a very close kind of relationship between the individual and the child they're sponsoring. So I would probably advise that if you are sponsoring orphans, that you should, you should kind of write it in the will that you're sponsoring a particular child or children and through a particular organization, so that money can be continued to, if it's within the means of the estate, to continue that sponsorship after the death. Yeah. Yes.
How can an adopted child be accommodated in the inheritance?
Good question. So he asked about adopted children, how they can be accommodated within the will. So obviously Islam doesn't recognize adoption processes in the same as a secular world that we live in, where they kind of take that child as a very direct member of the family. So within the actual will process, the adopted child would not directly inherit, so they wouldn't be within that category of the inheritors. But that's where that 1/3 of the will would come in. The person could note in the will from their 1/3 of their estate that an amount should go to that adopted child. That would be legally acceptable. Yes.
You have used the word executor.
Mm.
I think it's synonymous to what is wasi or wasiyah.
Yeah, correct. Yes.
But there are confusions with some other terminologies. For example, there was a word coming as beneficiary in
Mhm.
terms of insurance, and then power of attorney.
Mhm.
For the legal ones. So I just wanted to be very clearly spelled out that what are the steps which should be taken, or the actions to be taken, so that our religious will, written as you just mentioned, can be validated and respected in the law of the country.
Mhm.
This will be our last question, by the way.
Yeah.
Wrap up for Salim.
Sure. Do you want to touch on that?
Religious.
So how can we make sure that our religious will is going to be respected within the laws of the country? So, for example, you buy this book or the one that Maulana Rizvi has, or you draft your own will, lay out all however you want everything to be done. You have your two witnesses witness that they've gone through it. They witness that this is your wishes. You have two executors agree to come on board to execute the will when you pass away. So from that perspective, I would say that perspective, once all those signatures are there, the paperwork is completed. From the Islamic point of view, you've covered all of your bases. But then I guess the question will come is that what is the level of interaction with the legal, with a lawyer? What level of interaction is needed to kind of make sure that everything is kind of completed properly, so that there will be hopefully no challenges to that will.
Yeah, so I mean, lawyers only come in when someone challenges the will in the first place, and there has to be grounds to challenge the will. If there's a beneficiary who's not been noted in the will, and they're an adopted child, they have the same rights in common law as a biological child. because you've adopted them. You're their part guardian, and your spouse is also their part guardian, right? So whatever you owe to your biological children, you also owe to your adopted children, right? So they could very well challenge the will on that basis. And when it gets contested, and when it goes through an interpretation of a will application in court, that's when the lawyers get involved. And that's when you get a lawyer to first do something called an affidavit of execution, which is what I was talking about earlier, which is when a lawyer comes in and notarizes or commissions saying that someone actually did sign as a witness at that time of the will of that person who has now passed away, who is now deceased, right? Which is why it's important to have two independent witnesses and to also have two executors. So executors of the will are different than the people executing the will, right? So when I say executing the will, I mean someone signing on literally on a piece of paper that's been typed or that's been handwritten or whatever else, right? People can come about and contest in various different ways. Beneficiaries can come up and say, my dad on his deathbed said he's going to give me the Mercedes-Benz, which I've heard before within our own community, right? And you can say, well, yeah, you're a little crazy for saying that because he's on his deathbed and now he's passed away, but people do that, right? And that is an oral contestation of the interpretation of that will. Has the dad written in the will that that car will go towards that particular son? Probably not. He probably just mentioned it. And so the other beneficiaries will come in and will say, you know what, dad actually didn't mention that. Maybe he mentioned it to you privately, but he didn't tell it to anybody else. And he also didn't write it in the will that we all have, right? So that's where contestation is something, and that's a very simple example. I can get a lot more deeper, but I don't want to confuse anyone too much. I think we're confused as it is with all the terminologies and stuff. The power of attorneys for personal care and for property come before someone passes away. They do not apply after someone passes away, and they cannot apply. They're only in the sense, for example, I visited an old woman who was 101 years old. She has dementia. She had a POA signed for her personal care and property, and she's a billionaire. Her husband passed away a long time ago. She was a billionaire at that time. She has a bunch of sons. She has a bunch of daughters. Everyone's fighting over properties and valuations and assets and stuff like that. And she wants to change the will to change the estate trustee, which is different from an executor. An executor is someone who executes the will, like, okay, 50% goes to this person, 50 goes to this person, and that's it. Khalas, this person's out of the picture. The estate trustee is someone who administers the property that's left behind. For example, if you have minors, you need an estate trustee. You might even need to appoint a litigation guardian if your spouse is not around, if your spouse is predeceased Jew, right? So these are all terms, and I don't want to confuse anyone, so I'm trying to just make the definitions very, very clear.
Thank you so much for the Q&A. There's some great questions that were asked. Unfortunately, we are out of time as Salah is like in 1 minute. So, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Probably need some help setting up for Salah as well. So probably redivide this section as we had before, and then we'll start putting our prayer mats so we can get Salah started.